pleasure to be here. And, Mike and I did work together at Hapag, and most of the time Mike harassed me about my customers not paying their bills and things like that. He did a really good job at that. But, we've since moved on. I've forgiven him from having me in a headlock 90% of the time. Now I work at a technology company here in New York City. So you can see I'm sitting here in the office in World Trade Center and doing a lot of different things for different companies, and happy to talk about that. But I would say as we go through the material, I prepared a short presentation. I have a lot of slides I could show you, but people get bored sometimes. So I'd rather just kind of talk through some of the things that have happened in the shipping industry, and feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, whatever suits you. Happy to take any questions at any point. So don't feel like you have to wait until the end. Happy to take it as we go on. So if nothing else, then I'll go ahead and get into the material unless there's any other questions, comments. Nope. Okie dokie. So I'm going to share my screen. Share. Okay, here's my deck. And there we go. So as Mike mentioned, I spent 26 years on the carrier side. Some might call me a carrier apologist because some people get very upset with the ocean carriers, and maybe I have some perspective on how they're thinking. So I tend to gravitate towards that way. So it's not that I think the carrier is always right. It's just that I think that I understand their way of thinking. It's a complicated industry. After leaving the ocean carrier side, I joined a technology company. So we actually now work with the ocean carriers and are trying to help them provide better visibility and data to their customers. And it's a complicated thing. And as we go through, you'll kind of get a sense of like some of the things that had happened. So if nothing else, I'm just going to continue to go forward. So just really three big points that I want to cover. I want to talk a little bit about what was life before COVID. And I think historically for years and years and years, things have really been the same in the shipping industry. And particularly after there was one major event that happened in 99 with the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. There's actually a new Ocean Shipping Reform Act introduced last year as well that passed legislation. Is still being written, but those I think are like two major events, but really the industry hasn't changed very much. And they might talk about the ocean shipping industry as one that lacks technology and visibility, something that's changing, by the way, but historically has been, like I said, very static, hasn't really changed and been the same. But we'll talk about that a little bit because I think it's important to gain some insight there and understand what things have been like for years and years and years. And then you go into this COVID era, which was, I think, 2 years of hell for most people that ship and build stuff. And then now, as we head into a post-pandemic environment, what does that look like? What are some things that you're seeing? And, I'm really bad at making predictions. I thought the Bears are going to make the playoffs this year. So tells you how good I am. And so I can talk about like some things that the data suggests, but certainly, don't base anything off of what I have to say. So, so getting into it, if we just look at 2019 and say that 2019 is sort of a time where things started to change. Up until that point, carriers have done a really good job in not making a lot of money, and historically they had very low profits. It's a very capital intensive business, buying ships, buying containers, repositioning these containers, bunkering costs, very high fixed costs. So it's a very expensive business to run. And they had very low margins. In fact, most years they had a negative EBITDA, and it just was very hard. And a lot of carriers had issues just being solvent. And there was one famous case of a bankruptcy that was Hanjin. They went out of business, I think, in, I guess it would have been 2016. But what you saw in the industry was just a tremendous amount of consolidation. And if you go back to, let's say, the environment in the mid to late 90s, There were probably about over 30 carriers, and they had about a 60% market share. Whereas you look at it today, and you have 10 carriers that have about a 90% market share. So things have changed quite a bit in the industry over time. Or I'm sorry, there's been consolidation, but you still saw these very low profits. What you saw was that carriers were consolidating and trying to get their costs down as revenue stayed low, because they're just trying to survive at that point. So that's a little bit of background. I could spend a lot of time talking about things that happened in the past, but I really want to get into like what had happened over the COVID period, and then what do we see happening in the future. But one important thing to note, and what this slide is trying to give you an impression on, is that in 2019, ocean carriers started to figure something out. And what they started to figure out is that if the ship's not full, maybe you shouldn't sail. And that sounds like Captain Obvious just showed up, and something pretty basic. But for a long time, carriers would sail with very low utilizations, and they would just always be very aggressive on competing with other carriers. But we saw in really on a minimal basis, started in 2018, but more so in 2019, and that was kind of like the year of the blank, if you will, that they started having blank sailings. And that, but basically what they said is like, hey, this week we plan to have a sailing. We can see there's low utilization. Why don't we skip sailing this week? Because, that'll just create some demand. And you can see these headlines are saying in 2019 is like, hey, carriers are now starting to make money. They lost money last year, but really across the carrier community, they started to make money. So the important takeaway there is that blank sailings started to improve a result, and frustrate some shippers, by the way, because one would argue that there was an artificial demand being created by taking out supply. But from a carrier perspective, the best way for them to control pricing was just really through supply and demand. They tried to differentiate on service. They tried to differentiate in different ways. Very difficult to do. But when there's space pressure, rate goes up. When space is open, rate goes down. And very basic economic formula there. But unfortunately for carriers, like I said, they tried a few different things, and they were largely unsuccessful. Before I go on, I just want to pause there and see if there's any questions or anything anyone wants to ask or add.
Don, how far in advance will a carrier blank a sailing? When blanking a sailing, it's basically you have on the schedule to call or depart or take a booking or run a ship. How far in advance before they cancel that ordinarily? So that leaves the shipper scrambling now to find another ship or wait for the next week or.
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is something I like in my life today. We deal a lot with blank sailings and the visibility on blank sailings, and the answer is it's really varied. So in some cases, for example, there was one ocean carrier that said, okay, we're a weekly service. We should plan on having 52 sailings in a year, but we're really only planning on 39 sailings for the year. So they're really taking out a quarter's worth of sailings. And that's what's planned. But that doesn't mean that they won't have other blanks. And there's a couple different drivers of why you'd blank. The first is low utilization. The second is that there's congestion, and that they just have ships getting bunched up at the ports. And what you saw during COVID is there were somewhere upwards of 100 ships off the coast of LA just at anchor. And there were like, all these people taking these pictures of these ships off the coast of LA. And then Joe Biden said, you can't get that close. You have to sit out there at sea. So, people couldn't see the problem. But in any case, it's varied. There's different circumstances why they should do it, but it's frustrating for shippers because it could happen next week, or it could happen, 2 months from now.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, just one other point I want to make, and I'm going to pick on Hapag-Lloyd because I used to work there, but it's not, they're not the exception here. I think you put any carrier in that category. But in 2019, just you'll see it again later, but they had a revenue of 14.1 billion, and they had an EBIT of 908 million. So that was an 80% increase. And Hapag, I would say, is regarded as one of the better run carriers and very good at producing a result when compared across carriers. But 2019 is when things started to change. Blank sailings were a big driver, and they made almost $1 billion in 1 year. So then what happens is, COVID, as we know, it starts to emerge at the beginning of 2020. And there are a few effects of that. Chinese New Year typically happens this time of year. This year it's early. For those that don't know, it was just over the weekend. So Sunday was the beginning of the Lunar New Year. And but in 2020, after the Lunar New Year, with what was going on in Wuhan and COVID starting to spread, that people weren't returning to work and factories weren't opening. And there was a few different reasons for that, because there were a lot of people that would commute from Wuhan and go to different factories in different places, and they weren't allowed to work, so the factories couldn't open, and everything was shutting down. So because of that, carriers were really aggressively blanking. The utilizations were somewhere near 20%. And when they have a very low capacity, they're not going to sail, which seems pretty obvious. And then what started to happen is things started to shut down in the US. So this whole idea of sheltering in place occurred, and, restaurants weren't open, travel wasn't possible, you couldn't go to a store. You had these essential stores, as you remember, that had food. Somehow Target and Walmart were very good beneficiaries of that because they sold other stuff besides food. But anyway, you could see that certain retailers were in a great position. And if you're Macy's, you're pretty upset because you didn't sell food and you weren't deemed to be essential. But you could see these things changing. And because of these things that were happening, there was a significant shift in consumer buying behavior. And, one might have thought it was only paper products because you saw these people with toilet paper or paper towels in their home all over the place, and create a lot of demand. But really, as people started to work from home, there was a fundamental shift from service items to goods, and that created an effect in the shipping industry, which you can see detailed here is, you see that spike of things shut down, and then you see this drift above the line, and this drift above the line is throughout a sustained period, which was just creating a ton of demand. And the effect of this demand was that there wasn't really good visibility to the carriers. At the time, I was working at CMA-CGM, and we weren't getting any forecasts or information about demand shifts. And the carrier was very slow to reintroduce capacity as a result, because no one knew, hey, is this going to happen for a month? We're asking retailers, what do you see? And they're like, I don't know what's happening. People are buying all this stuff now. And they're like, okay, well, let's just reintroduce some of our capacity that was blank sailed or tied up, because again, they had these very low utilizations. And I remember it was very frustrating working at a carrier at that point, because our management was just all over us to say, get a forecast from your shippers. But really going to the shippers, they didn't really understand what was happening either. And no one could have predicted this this explosion of demand that was happening in the shipping industry. And so these factors, limited supply, strong continuous demand, started to create all this upward rate pressure, and rates started to climb significantly, as a matter of fact, over this time period. But I'm just going to take a pause here and see if anyone has any questions or comments or anything they want to share at this point. Nope. Okay, I'll keep on going.
If I may, hi, Mehdi here. If I may, if you can maybe just talk to China and its role in inflating prices.
Yeah, I mean, China in and of itself, I think their role and their impact was, and up until recently, just largely impacted by their zero tolerance policy on COVID. So what you saw, and I mentioned demand here, but the other factor is that there was quite a bit of capacity being consumed by congestion, and the ships that were sailing at the ports or trying to get into the port of LA Long Beach, as an example, were out there for various time periods, and combine that with different ports that had shut down at different times. So like the port of Yantian had shut down because they had a COVID outbreak. And these types of things were causing all this capacity to be consumed, because what was happening then is that the ship wouldn't call Yantian. There was all kinds of demand. It would fill it up somewhere else. But now you have this backlog in Yantian, and then you have to try and clear that out. And now the port is congested because there's, this cargo just keeps coming into the port, but there's no ship there to take it away. But China really had no effect on directly anyway, on the type of pricing that you saw change. I think the thing that China had done is they really contributed to some of the capacity being consumed through, again, some of the strict COVID policies, which they've since relaxed. But it was very difficult navigating China, simply because they had a variety of shutdowns, and it would just consume capacity, and then the backlog would build. And from a carrier point of view, it actually worked out quite beneficially for them. But again, China had no direct involvement. Any other questions or anything anyone would like to understand better as I move on? Nope. Okay. So what was the effect of this? Well, carriers started having great results. And so what you saw is, let's say the prices was around about 1,800 in that period of 2019. You saw rates rise to over $20,000. And there was certainly an effect of that I'll get to in a second. But from a carrier perspective, I'd mentioned earlier about Hapag-Lloyd's results, and that's 14.1 billion and 908 million in EBIT. But you compare that to this period in 2021, and in the same time period, they had a $12 billion increase in revenue and a staggering $11.4 billion in EBIT. And these carriers were having incredible results. And a couple things I would say about it is that not everybody was being opportunistic. I think some carriers were being very opportunistic as far as charging high rates. At the same time, it's easy to blame the carriers for this. And here I go being a carrier apologist. But the fact of the matter is that carriers would their first instinct was to turn cargo away and say, listen, I'm full, I can't take anymore. It's like, listen, the shipper would say, listen, tell me what it's going to take to get on the ship. I just need space on the ship. I have this priority cargo. It's really in demand. I got to get it over there for Halloween or whatever the reason may be. Okay, the rate's $10,000. I'll pay $12,000. And then they would start paying $12,000. And this would happen. It would set a new threshold, and then it would go to 14 and 16. And anyway, so I saw a lot of this things happening, and it was very interesting to see, because as somebody who worked on the carrier side for a long time, it was very difficult environment. A lot of the revenue, you were always being squeezed. So if you were charging somebody 1,800, somebody would walk away if the rate was 1,750. And here you had the rates at $20,000. It was something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. But made a very good result across carriers. So you see in general that the carrier community did quite well. And while people were very upset about this because the headlines were bad, because there was all this congestion, if you tried to buy furniture or something, it took months for it to get here. So there's a very poor result. And you would say, like, wait a minute, there's all this congestion in the port. The service has never been worse, yet you're making billions from this. This is very frustrating. And I can certainly empathize with that. On the other hand, carriers had very thin and flimsy balance sheets. And the fact that they're now making money is probably good for the industry, because there are certain things that carriers wouldn't invest in, and particularly things like technology. And because of that, the industry was very inefficient and archaic. And now that carriers had a healthy balance sheet, they paid off a lot of debt. The company I had worked for prior or after Hapag-Lloyd was CMA-CGM, and they had around about $18 billion in debt, and now they're debt free. So, that's just one example, but it really across carriers, it solved some of those problems. And I think it fundamentally changes things going forward, which I'll get to in a minute. But there were some impacts of this. And one of the things you saw is that there were new carriers coming in, because you see these rate levels and it's like, wow, I can make some money here. It was more of a flawed assumption, because the charter rates were very high. So they went from, $100,000 a day upwards of like $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 a day. And there was a requirement to charter for a certain duration. So you had to sign up for 3, 5, 10 years if you're going to get your hands on a ship. And so that's what these new entrants did. And they had a very high cost base. And spoiler alert, most of them have gone away as of today. But there was a time there where they could definitely make some money. But some other things happened, is that governments really started to look at carriers, and their constituents were complaining. You might have heard something about like these farmers and hay shippers that couldn't get a container because carriers were prioritizing exports because they didn't pay a lot of money. It made sense for them to send the container over empty and grab one of those high $10,000, $15,000 rates and bring that container back because they were running out of equipment. But, the US government's going to say, like, hold on a second, I'm helping you import into the country, which is actually having a negative effect here, because we want to help, the farmer or these manufacturers in the US. We don't want to necessarily help things that are manufactured somewhere else. And this really led to the Ocean Shipping Reform Act being passed last year. And it's actually one of the only bills that was co-sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican. It was Congressman Rhodes of South Dakota and Congressman Giamandi of California that co-wrote the bill, and it passed legislation. So it was some, and what that did is it actually increased the Federal Maritime Commission power to deal with carrier matters, because before they were more of just a compliance organization, and now they've become a penalty organization, and they've assessed some carriers some $1 million fines. But anyway, this is one of the effects. And just in general, people felt negative about the carriers. There was a lot of frustration about how they were performing, and they're, again, opportunists making all this money off of a terrible situation, and got them perhaps in a little bit of trouble. I knew I threw a lot out there, but I'll just pause there and see if there's any questions or anything you'd like for me to dive into further.
Yeah, Don, this is Jim. I apologize, I came on late, but what was the congressman? You said Rhodes, from where?
It was Rhodes of South Dakota. I think he's South Dakota. Could have been North Dakota, but it was Rhodes. And Giamandi, I'd have to look up the spelling of his name. He attended we had a symposium in DC. He was there in person, but it would be OSRA of 2022, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act.
Okay.
And that's there were a few different things that happened as a result of that. It also made it more complicated for carriers to charge detention demurrage. So, and again, this is, so you can say what you want about it, but what would happen is containers would get stuck somewhere, and Seattle as an example. And you'd see the containers, they would get discharged on the terminal. And then what would happen is that next ship would come in, and the containers that had been discharged weren't all cleared, but you had to clear out these other ships because, again, there's all this congestion. So they would discharge this other ship. Well, what would happen is that there were containers that would stay buried on the terminal because they couldn't get it out. Now, the rules say that the carrier is allowed to charge you storage, even though you physically can't get your container. Now, how does that make any sense? Well, it doesn't make any sense, but the rules say I can charge you for storage. It doesn't say I can't charge you for storage if it's not your fault. So anyway, and this ignited all this legislation, and there are all these like examples, which is why today the Federal Maritime Commission has more powers around enforcement, and one of those things being detention demurrage, the other being entering into fair contracts with shippers.
Gotcha. And then, so post COVID, yeah, you've washed out some of these, well, just lack of a better word, I guess, carriers that kind of, came into the market. So how many total in the top, whatever?
Oh, well,
80%. I mean, how many are left at this point,
yeah, I mean, there's probably, I would say, you could debate this number with me, but I would say there's like 9 major players.
Okay.
There was 9 major players before, 9 major players after. These new entrants came in, they were very small, and they were doing different things, started charter ships, but they were largely unsuccessful because, again, when things will start to change, and you'll see that in a minute. And once things started to change, there was a definite effect there. But really, from a carrier standpoint, all the consolidation that had happened in the years prior, that had really taken a lot of the cost out there. And like Hapag-Lloyd, for example, had acquired 3 different carriers. So they CP ships, CSAV, and UASC. And that's just one example. You could say this about Maersk and others. But there was a point where the carrier said, look, you can't squeeze anything else out of the cost curve. Like there's not really much more benefit of scale. So, through acquisition, does it really make sense? And the answer at that time was no. And I think most carriers are in a similar position.
They seem to be diversifying now, Don. The carriers, going into using all these profits, there's these beefed up balance sheets, going into air freight and so many other avenues now.
Absolutely. I mean,
Hapag just acquired terminals. Right.
And it's a wild industry. So you've seen carriers do a few things, and there would be this argument to say, like, okay, we're an ocean carrier, and if we say an ocean carrier, provides ocean service, but if you think about like supply chain, that's a whole cake, and that cake includes warehousing, domestic trucking, air freight, rail. And why are we only taking a little slice of the cake? Maybe if we like start to dive into a bigger piece of the cake, we can make more money. Now, one could argue and say, like, hey, you've done a bad job of making money, and when you just had an ocean carrier, why do you want to take on these other things? And you can debate that. But the interesting thing about terminals, Mike, is that carriers prior to 2019, they were selling terminals. And I mean, CMA-CGM is a great example. They had this Phoenix terminal that they owned out in LA, and they sold that terminal and they bought it back for 6 times the price, 2.5 years later. And now you had the money, and somebody got rich off that, but for them, they were reducing their costs. But you see them like sort of pivot. I mean, we saw Hapag-Lloyd sell a lot of their terminal interests when we were there, and now they're buying those terminal interests. So they're trying to do different things, and as you mentioned, there's a few carriers that have bought planes. CMA-CGM has partnered with Air France to run some planes. MSC just bought some planes. So you can just see the carriers getting into different things. And my perspective on this is it probably makes sense for them to do that, because I do think there's a world where they can start to participate and provide more of a full supply chain solution to some of these companies, whether they have a forwarder, whether they have planes, et cetera, versus just somebody who's just providing ocean services. But Hapag-Lloyd has said, like, we're not going to really get into that. Well, we might buy terminals, but we're not going to buy a forwarder because that's not our business model.
Maersk was interesting by acquiring the 3PL with performance teams and acquiring the trucking, the warehousing, you know, almost to like an end-to-end, point-to-point, you know, control of that chain.
Yeah. And they've been a lot more aggressive. Now, the funny thing about that is, let's just talk about the industry for a second. You know, there's shippers, there's a shipper bucket here, and there's these NVOs, these forwarders over here. And these NVOs, for those that don't know, are basically a marketplace. So what they do is they buy space from the carriers and then they sell it to somebody else. And they're allowed to do that. They create their own bill of lading, and they in some ways act as a carrier without having to buy a ship. And so they're asset light and they're actually fairly profitable. But if you go into this category like Maersk has and said, I'm going to have a 3PL and I'm going to have my own forwarder, you're really competing against something that comprises around about half the market. And they've basically abandoned, for the most part, that market. And they've slowly whittled down the number of NVOs they deal with, where like Hapag-Lloyd deals with thousands of NVOs. They maybe deal with like 5 at Maersk. That's just their strategy. I mean, you could argue whether or not that strategy makes sense, but you know, that's what they're doing, and they seem like they've been pretty successful doing it. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, comments before I move on? Well, hopefully at least this is interesting, or you think like, what a wacky industry. Why would anyone get involved in that? And in 1994, when I started in the industry, I had no idea it was going to be this wild either. And who knows what the next 10 or 15 years looks like. So, you know, what happened at the end of 2022? Like what was the market like at the end of last year? And it's funny to look at these headlines, but you know, you can see that things really kind of changed, that you know, this demand had really started to shift, that the consumption had started to change. You start to see like these bankruptcies, these layoffs for these different retailers. And I know some companies really struggled with their supply chain, that they were really choking on the fact that they couldn't keep their shelves full, and there were missed opportunities there. So it was very problematic, and there was just lost revenue. You couldn't make that up. So if you're Spencer Gifts and your most of your revenue comes from something like Halloween, if you can't fill your shelf, then you know that's just a missed opportunity there, and you're stuck. So there was a lot of thinking around like, what am I going to do? How do I need to manage my supply chain? And I think there's a few different thoughts about that, because effectively the supply has stayed the same, but now the demand has dropped significantly. And it was one of those rare periods in the industry where all the available capacity was really deployed on the ocean. So now you see this demand drop. It's a question of like, what do you do? Like, if I'm an ocean carrier, what do you do? And this is, you know, some questions of like, you know, what is 2023 going to look like? We're 1 month in, and what's going to happen? And there's a lot of different thoughts here, and I'm going to share my perspective, but I'm happy to take more questions on this. But the first thing that people say is that, you know, is this a return to normal? And what normal would be are just low rates. So what we've seen is, you know, I mentioned rates went from 1,800 to 20,000. Today, the current spot rate is $1,200. And that's quite a swing. So is this a return to normal? Because you can say space is available. So there's very relatively low utilizations from the carriers, let's say about 80%. So there's not any space pressure. the congestion in the ports. I mentioned there were 100 ships outside of LA. Today, there are no ships docked outside of LA. And it's going to lead to poor carrier results. And I would say that we haven't seen that. I would say that the carrier results haven't really declined so much yet. That's largely due to the fact that I mentioned the current spot rate's $1,200, but not 100% of the business moves on the spot rate. And some moves on a longer term rate, some moves on the spot rate. So where does that fit? Well, I think it's somewhere north of there, and carriers are still posting fairly good results. Do I think it's a return to normal? And I don't. And just like, what I showed in the beginning, that carriers, in the absence of a big, pandemic and making all kinds of wild money, they started to figure something out as far as like, how do I make money in this environment? And what they do is they blank sail. And I think what you see and what you're going to see are more blank sailings, where it's going to create space pressure. And there's already been some signaling, by the way, in 2023, because Hapag-Lloyd did something that they've never done before this year, which is this is round about the time that carriers announce their network. So they say, okay, we're going to deploy some new service to Indonesia, or we're going to take out this service. But they usually, about this time of year, say, this is what our service is going to look like in April. And that's in advance of the next contract cycle, which in the import markets from Asia is normally from May to April. But this year, in the Far East trade, so from Asia to Europe, Hapag-Lloyd took out a service and they bought space on CMA-CGM. So they're part of this Oceans Alliance. And that was very interesting because they've never partnered with CMA-CGM before, but it's also a signal to say, we're not going to deploy capacity if there's capacity available in the market. So I think carriers are smart enough and aggressive enough that they're going to look for ways to make sure that there is some space pressure, because again, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the few tools they have to keep prices high. Another question is contract fulfillment a non-issue? Now, a lot of people are surprised by this, but in the ocean industry, it's not uncommon that if you have a contract to move 10,000 containers in a year, if you don't move 10,000 containers, there's no penalty. And so that's confusing for a lot of people, because like, wait a minute, I had a contract to say move 10,000. I didn't move 10,000. So shouldn't one or the other party get a penalty? And the answer is that it typically doesn't happen. The reason why it doesn't happen is because these contracts are actually fairly ambiguous when it comes to space. And just to give you, for instance, if it's 10,000 TEUs, it's around about 200 TEUs a week. 200, let's just talk in units because TEUs are weird for a lot of people. So let's say it's 10,000 containers and it's 200 containers a week. And for the month of January, you only move 160. And then for the month of February, you move 180. And in March, you show up and say, well, I got to move 10,000. So you have to make the space available to me because I'm already behind and I have to make that up. And if I'm a carrier, depending on my circumstance, I may say like, I can't let you make that up because I don't have the space available. So if they don't make the space available, is it the carrier's fault? Should you be permitted to do that? Is it your fault because you didn't perform well at the beginning? And, this debate could go around and around in circles. But the point is that because the contracts aren't clear, it's very hard to determine, is it your fault or is it my fault? So is this not going to be an issue? And what had happened is during the COVID period is that carriers started to write contracts that were more enforceable. Terms were clear. And will this continue? And I think the intent of the carriers is to make it continue, because to put things in perspective, it's Mike's good friend, Rolf Haben-Jensen, who's the CEO of Hapag-Lloyd. He said, carriers are taking all this abuse. I said, carriers were in everyone's crosshairs as far as the enemy was concerned. And he was talking to the media and they're like, look, why don't you take all these customers, cargo, et cetera. And he said, look, Hapag-Lloyd, we move 240,000 TEUs a week. We have to book 400,000 TEUs a week in order to carry that 240,000 TEUs. And that's really interesting. If you think like, wow, you have to book so much more to land at 240,000, there's all this inefficiency there. And if you had enforceable contracts that had to be clear, maybe you don't have to worry about this fall down so much. Again, a point that could be debated. We don't need to spend time here discussing it. It's just one of the things that I could see carriers trying to get to more of these enforceable type of contracts. Then the other point I try and raise here is that our shocks to the supply chain, are they not as impactful now? There was this Ever Given that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and it was like the first thing that happened where people became aware of supply chain. I had friends asking me like, hey, you work in supply chain, what about this Ever Given? And anyway, had all these massive effects, but there was this congestion on the West Coast. There were rails issues in the US. And so will they, if there's something like that that happens, will it be less impactful than it might have been during the COVID period? And I would say that I think this is a pretty significant risk. And the reason why I think it's such a risk is because carriers are already mapping out their plans on how they're going to blank sail and what type of utilization they're going to have. Again, these people are not stupid. They want to make money. They are a for-profit organization. And if that being the case, then if they plan on skipping sailings and there's a shock, some sort of ship getting stuck somewhere or something, it's just going to be hard for them to react. And then you're going to see this snowball a bit over that time period. So the point being is it's going to be a challenge if there is some sort of shock and some sort of operational impact, because again, I think carriers are already planning, or I know carriers are already planning to blank sail, but to what extent do they do that, and how does that coincide with a shock? It's very difficult. And then the last thing I raise here, and then I'll officially open it up for questions, because I think this is my last point, my last slide, is that will continued increased government regulation continue? And you saw this in the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. There's this talk of carriers losing antitrust immunity. So I mentioned there's 9 carriers. There's 3 alliances. So MSC and Maersk, the top 2 largest carriers, they share a network together. So they share space on each other's ship. Hapag-Lloyd is part of the alliance, THE alliance, with O&E and Yang Ming and some others. And then you have the Ocean Alliance, which is CMA-CGM, Evergreen, and some of these other carriers. But the point is that there is a discussion in Europe right now, actually, to vote on whether or not carriers should be allowed for this to continue. And that people are still really upset about the carriers, and they say, they made all this money, that we should suspend these alliances and make them run their networks on their own, which to me is a bit of an emotional reaction. I don't think that's a very good idea. Again, I'm a carrier apologist. But I think the effect is that you're going to see carriers become niche because they don't have the fleet to manage running an entire network on its own. There's only one carrier that has the size to do that, and that's MSC. But no other carrier has the size to run a complete network by themselves. So if that's the case, and I can't share space on ships, you're going to see carriers go at certain places alone, which is then going to change the available services and limit services, I think, for shippers. So I think there's other things you can do, but that isn't one of them. But do I think that there's going to be continued increased government regulation? I do. And that's unfortunate because I think the government, isn't equipped to deal with some of these complex issues. They just come in with a big stick and just, whack the carriers and say you shouldn't do that. Well, again, you've already started to see that. And then the change of carrier behavior to avoid those types of penalties, I don't think are going to be good for anyone. So Again, that's just my own opinion, but anyway, well, it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. And my last point would be that I think 2023 is going to be a very telling year because, again, I think things have started to change back to where they were in 2019. And what comes next is, again, anyone's guess. But I reckon that sometime later this year that you're going to see things start to tighten up again. And how well carriers can, avoid leaving cargo behind versus being equipped to handle everything. It's going to be interesting to see all unfold. But anyway, that's what I prepared for you tonight. Hopefully you found it interesting. And at this point, I'd just like to see if there's any other questions or any other points that you'd like to talk about in this space.
Yeah, Don,
Oh, go ahead, Jess. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Jim, Jess, go ahead.
So, it's very interesting. I've been in and around the shipping industry in a bunch of different capacities and technology. And, the container industry was always known pretty much as the liner service because it was a very predictable, scheduled, the routes, it was like running train schedules on Metro North or something like that. Maybe something's a little late, but you kind of know what the schedule is every day of the week. As they start to do more blank sailings, don't they run the risk of being treated more like a spot market and having some of the wild swings and creating volatility in the pricing that would typically be seen on the tanker or bulker side?
They do. And I mean, let's just look at a couple data points as we kind of unpeel that question. The most effective carrier at being on time, and I forget who it was, it might have been Maersk, but the carrier that was the most on time, they were 52% of on time on their schedule. And we're in a period where carriers have never been more off schedule. And I would say that carriers have less concern over that, frankly. I mean, to be fair, there are some like priority services that they run where they, guarantee some transit time and there's some demand for that. And there's a carrier like Matson Navigation that's kind of the gold standard in this space and does a pretty good job on it. But I don't see carriers prioritizing being on time, and I think it's just hard for them to do that, for one. And I think that carriers are, I don't see that changing anytime soon. Could it be more of like a commodity? That's always the fear, and carriers hate to be referred to as a commodity. But I think they're trying to do different things to differentiate themselves. But I also think that carriers have started to build tools so they could operate in the spot space better. Maersk was the first one with Maersk Spot. But now CMA has a tool, Hapag-Lloyd has a tool. And, what I think is that carriers are going to start to move more like, again, this is a wild prediction. Okay. So don't take this to the bank, but I see them moving more towards like where the airlines are. They can only get to that place once they have like commitments around their contracts, because the problem with spot is that if I have this 40% fall down and I'm trying to price something that may look full today may not be full tomorrow. And if that happens, my price point, I might have just priced too high and not gotten that container when I should have priced lower to get that container on the ship because space became available later. But with these fall downs, it's really hard to measure how full is a ship going to be. So I think you need that stability with having more enforced contracts, which again, there's all kinds of speculation there. But if you have enforced contracts, you have more predictability about how full your ship is going to be, the better able you are to charge spot pricing. And I think a carrier would ideally like to have both, but spot pricing is not really bad for a carrier because they tend to make more money when they can charge a spot price versus just having these longer term contracts.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead. Any
Don,
other
I was going to bring up the order book. How does, last I saw the order book, there was a significant amount being built up. How does it look? What do you think they're going to do? There seems to be some type of balance now. You throw a good amount of supply back on the water, and it's going to dramatically impact the rate. The ships are bigger, not as big. I mean, I don't think they're doing the 22s, 23s, but what do you see in the order book and its impact?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that MSC is clearly ordering ships very aggressively. And so MSC passed Maersk as the largest carrier in the world last year. Maersk hasn't responded to that, and Maersk has clearly taken a position like, we're in business to make money. We're not in business to say we're the largest. So they haven't pushed that at all. Now, there's a few things with the order book that have been happening. The first is that carriers have been delaying scrapping. So typically carriers scrap their vessels, and with, all this high demand, they were delaying scrapping because they wanted every asset available on the ocean. And so now if our carriers would argue and say, well, I have this scrapping I was going to do anyway. Now that I have new ships, I might now push forward some scrapping that I had originally delayed. The other thing that people don't really talk about too much, and it still remains to be seen, but there's this new IMO regulation. So the IMO, International Maritime Organization, they have rules around bunkering, and their first foray was this low sulfur fuel, which was introduced in 2020. And they said, carriers, you need to burn low sulfur fuel, or if you burn heavy fuel, you need these scrubbers to clean the fuel so there's less pollutants in the air. And by the way, this is a real problem. If you took all of the carriers and all the traffic on the ocean and added it together, they produce the same amount of pollutants as like Germany does, the entire country of Germany. So it's in the top 5 of pollution drivers in the world. So anyway, there was this new standard in 2023, which said that you can only create so much emission. And if you create a certain amount of emission, that you have to fix your pollutants. And what they did is they came up with this ABCDE scale. And if you were in a D or an E, that meant that you had to fix that problem you were having as far as creating pollutants. And a D ship could be fixed in 3 years. An E ship or ship system or what have you had to be fixed in a year. Now, you could say, well, a year. I mean, first of all, you have to get the rating. You have a year to do it. Why would I do it? Well, why you would do it is a lot of these carriers have come out and said, there's a mandate to be carbon neutral in 2050. I want to beat that mandate of being carbon neutral. I'm going to do it in 2045. Well, if that's your ambition, then why aren't you already compliant, 100% compliant with IMO 2023? And so there's some carriers, and they tend to be European carriers, which have a lot more optics around their environmental sustainability, which I think are in a different category than maybe some other carriers that don't care as much. And there seem to be some carriers that don't care as much, certainly don't advertise it. But the point is, this IMO regulation, if you're going to be compliant, what this really means is that you're going to have to sail in 2 directions at the same speed, because carriers, what they do is they slow steam from Asia to the US because that's a more efficient fuel burn. And then when they get to the US, they race back to Asia to make up the time. And it's a very fuel inefficient process. And so when the IMO looks at this and they say, well, hey, you got to sail at the same speed. Well, if I'm going to sail at the same speed, it means I'm more susceptible to congestion. I can't do these sorts of things. So I might need to add a vessel to my rotation in order to maintain that service like I have, which as a carrier, that kind of stinks, because I'm just adding a ship. I'm creating cost on top of a service that might have been profitable. So that's a very long answer to your question, but there are things that are happening in the industry which are consuming some of that capacity. So it's not just going to be like carrier deploys a ship and like, oh no, what do we do now? There's not the demand to support the supply. There's other things that are happening that have been thought through to say, there's some other factors that affect it. So it still remains to be seen. I don't think it's going to be quite as bad as like things you read in the media, because the media tends to say, here's the current capacity, here's the order book, that equals not enough
Right.
demand to fill those ships, so rates will go down. That's a very simple way to look at it, and I don't think that's necessarily 100% right.
Got it. Hey, Don, this is
Thanks,
Jim.
Don.
I'm going to switch questions to the shipper side, their perspective. If you've got 9 major players and you have 3 alliances that are out there, definitely huge risk. I agree with you on that. But how do you go to market from a shipper's perspective? Should you try to diversify, not worry so much on the carriers, but from the alliance perspective? And if so, is that a good strategy? And really, you're trying to do 2 things. One, from a finance side, reduce cost if you can, or at least get a good rate, right? A fair rate. And then second, you just want to keep the operation moving, right? So should we focus on diversifying within the alliances, and is that maybe a good strategy or not?
I think it's a good strategy depending on what your supply chain strategy is. If the shipper's value proposition is cost and I just want the lowest price, then you might be a little indifferent or immune. It's a little hard to execute that strategy because you're just going for the lowest price, and it may be 2 carriers on the same alliance. But I think if you have strategy and you see that you can use your supply chain as a strategic advantage over similar competitors, which I think there are shippers in that category, then I think the first thing you have to do is really diversify, make sure that you're somehow split between those 3. And it doesn't have to be 33% each, but have some sort of diversification. And I think that's really critical, because the bad news is if I have all my cargo on the Ocean Alliance and they have a blank sailing, I'm stuck. I have nowhere else to go. Whereas if I have 3 carriers, or 3 carrier in each alliance, then I can say that's okay, because the odds of the 2M having space or someone else having space on the same week is high. So I think that's one part. But I think the other thing is, and this is probably underestimated, but I really think it's true, is this whole idea of being a shipper of choice and building relationships with carriers. I think, or if you use a forwarder, being the NVO, a shipper of choice for the NVO, because I think it matters. This is still a relationship business. You can say whether that's a good or bad thing, but I think it's a relationship business. And by building those relationships and demonstrating that you really want to have a partnership, it's not a partnership of convenience or a partnership of need that you say, hey, my container's stuck in New York. I thought we're partners. Can't you dig it out? I think it's more about like really saying, like, I want to understand what your needs are. I want to see how my business can fit into your needs, and really trying to connect on different levels of management with those organizations, because the day will come where you need help. And if you're just, another person in the 100 queue of phone calls, it's just hard to make anything happen. So, and you just may not have the diversified strategy within the alliances. It may only help you to a point. You may just need that help within that NVO or carrier. And I think that is also very important. But I think those 2 things are big for me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, Don, just a question. So demand obviously still feels high outbound out of Southern Asia and Southeast Asia. And all the lines that we ship out of there, it just seems the variance as far as how high rates still continue to go in that route. It feels like the carriers are still trying to make money where they can make money. And the spot rates are totally useless in that everyone's booking out of South Asia and Southeast Asia so early because they're afraid of getting capacity because demand's up. Is that the delta between that and China? Do you see that coming down ever?
Well, I mean, I think the complexity is with Southeast Asia is that you just have limited capabilities there. There still is demand problems there, and it's not like China. The first problem is China really dwarfs the rest of Asia in terms of its production. And, even though that Trump was trying to change this and impose all these tariffs with China, it was really a nebulous impact in terms of like production shifts. I mean, it happened, but not as much as you might think if you like follow the media. So when you have that perspective and say like, okay, the effect, it didn't really push volumes out of China. It did to some extent, but again, China still dwarfs everywhere else in Asia. There's still a heavy network going in and out of Asia and in and out of China. Now, Southeast Asia is different. These ports are very small. Their terminals, can't handle a lot of capacity, and there's a lot that's handled by feeders. And these feeders, which by the way, are significantly impacted by this new IMO regulation, it makes it very difficult. So while the mainline vessel at some point is going to connect to a mainline vessel, whether that's in Lam Chabang or in Singapore, but it's going to connect somewhere. But if it's a 400, 300 TEU feeder, it might be hard to get out of it, like Jakarta, Indonesia. If you could be in Singapore in a direct port, but that ship, there's 5 sailings a week from Shanghai to LA, there's 1 or 2 sailings a week out of Singapore. So I think rates have dropped across the board. Make no mistake. The first was China to West Coast. Now it's China to East Coast. Those rates are finally coming down. Will it be Southeast Asia? I think it will. I think some things still need to subside there. But again, I think it's a lot more greatly exposed to risk just because the connecting points there, these feeder services or the number of services, make capacity still tight there.
Thanks.
Any other
That's
questions?
awesome insights because I didn't even kind of separate the two. So great question, Chuck, and appreciate it, Don.
It just, I mean, the fact of the matter is, especially out of South Asia, forget about South Asia, out of Pakistan and India, we're all booking so early because we're so afraid still everyone keeps saying there's capacity. Well, we're afraid there isn't capacity. And so that's obviously impacting rates. And I just feel like the carriers are going to make money where they can make money. And they know that we're all scared of getting goods out. And we ship a lot to South America. We ship a lot to Europe. We ship to Australia and just here. And it just feels scary that they're going to make money where they can. Those rates aren't going to come down nearly as much as everywhere else.
Yeah, and I think an effective strategy could be to also leverage things. I mean, there's things carriers want, and it gets into this idea of being a shipper of choice, but to talk to them, like if you go, to Latin America, or you go to like Australia, New Zealand, or Europe, these are things carriers want. Rates across the board have started to come down, demand has come down, but the fact that you can bring these things to the table, it's interesting for the carriers. It's rather than just dealing with everything in its own little silo, that if you could bundle things together, I think that tends to be interesting for carriers.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions, comments? Hopefully this is interesting for you. This is all I do. So for me, it's just, I'm just like talking, and I probably forget that, maybe some of these terms are alien to people. So sorry for that. But again, hopefully it was at least somewhat insightful and, and you got something out of it. And, if you ever wanted to have me back and like double click on a particular topic or, talk about, I don't know, contracting strategies, happy to do it. If you find it interesting, if Mike tells me like, listen, you were the worst guest we've ever had, then I'll be like, oh, shucks. All right. Well,
I think it was really great, Don. Don, just quickly, I know you have to run to another engagement, another speaking engagement. Could you tell us about your podcast? One thing I listened to, you most recently, The History of Shipping Part 1, and I know you're working on Part 2. So if I encourage everybody to really subscribe to this podcast, it's very interesting. Supply chain secrets. But Don, how is that going? If you want to tell us a little about your about this?
Yeah, sure. It's a show that I started with former VP of supply chain at Walmart, Brian Most. Brian has moved on to other things. He was at CMA-CGM and now he's at a company called Cargomatic. Still a good friend of mine, actually. But we kept with the show. So I kept doing it. And now I have someone else who's been co-hosting with me, a young woman by the name of Caroline Weaver. And we're doing a bunch of different things talking about supply chain. So our last episode that we recorded was about surcharges, and we unpacked some things on surcharges. But the whole idea is like to talk about different things. We also have a few guests in the pipeline. If anyone wants to come and like talk to us, and happy to do it. And but it's really all revolving around like the ocean shipping space. We're starting to do like more historical stuff because we got some feedback that our show has been like a teaching tool for some people to say, hey, I have new employees. Your industry's weird. Can you create some content to help them, understand the industry? Or like, oh, well, yeah, when you've been doing it for almost 30 years, you're like, it just sounds normal, but to most, you talk to your neighbors and it's like, it's weird. So anyway, so we're doing stuff like that. And it's, as Mike says, it's available on Apple, Spotify, wherever you find a podcast. It's something we do for fun. It's not just like a NYSHEX commercial or anything. It's really more about the industry, and we're just looking for ways to help the industry.
Thank you, everybody. Don, thank you so much for doing this. You were fantastic.
Great.